Hello and welcome to Plugged In. This week, a country in chaos. How did Venezuela go from stability and wealth to the edge of political and financial ruin? Once among the richest countries in the southern hemisphere, hyperinflation, unemployment, and a shortage of food and medicine have forced more than 3 million Venezuelans to flee to neighboring countries. But amid the protests and the rising humanitarian costs, international uncertainty is growing over who is really in charge, President Nicolas Maduro or legislative leader Juan Guaido. The United States, Russia, and China are all weighing in. We'll speak to a geopolitical analyst, an economic expert, and one of our reporters about what is in store for Venezuela and why so many countries are vying for a piece of it. We are live on Facebook at Voice of America, and we want your comments and questions. With food prices doubling every 19 days, Venezuela's inflation rate is now the highest in the world. And with the country's economy locked in a downward spiral, many Venezuelans are either unemployed, sick, or in dire need of food. International aid continues to arrive, but as VOA's Christina Caicedo-Smith reports, much of that aid, about 50 tons of food and medicine, remains locked in warehouses, unable to reach those who need it most.
After the arrival of the first load of aid from the U.S. and Colombian governments to the international Tienditas Bridge in Cúcuta, Venezuela's self-proclaimed interim president Juan Guaido sent a direct message to the Venezuelan armed forces during a VOA interview.
Ellos saben lo que está pasando en Venezuela. Ellos tienen familia, tienen amigos que se fueron del país.
They know what is happening in Venezuela. They have friends who had left the country. They suffer what we all suffer. This is an order for the military. Allow humanitarian aid to enter. It will be a turning point for you. Not saving lives implies a crime against humanity.
Contrariar esa orden sería ir en contra de la humanidad y la vida de venezolanos.
U.S. Ambassador to Colombia Kevin Whitaker welcomed the food supplies, emphasizing the United States had helped Venezuelans with more than $140 million. He says more help is expected.
This is a down payment. This is just a beginning. It's important, it's significant. It will be distributed to Venezuelans in Venezuela.
Ambassador Whitaker also thanked Colombian President Iván Duque for the transportation of this first lot of help into the Venezuelan border.
On the Colombian side, our mission is to transport, store, and supervise, have all the pertinent security up to the border.
At the International Simón Bolívar Bridge, thousands of Colombian and Venezuelan nationals cross between countries every day. After the first shipment of aid, which consists in items like rice, coffee, powdered milk, and canola oil, among other items, more Venezuelans are asking where that aid is going to be delivered. In the meantime, while the food and medicine are safely stored in a warehouse at the Tienditas Bridge, 65-year-old Venezuelan Carmen Sanchez is hoping the food can be delivered in Venezuela.
The only thing I ask God is that Maduro leaves and that there is no battle with other countries, much less people dead.
For other Venezuelans that cross the bridge every day, the only way of buying things like onions, rice, and eggs is in Colombia. They claim there is no work and no money to buy things that are overpriced in Venezuela.
The aid has to get to Venezuela. In Venezuela, people are dying. That is the reality.
Venezuela's president in dispute, Nicolas Maduro, rejected the U.S. humanitarian aid and would not allow it into the country, assuring Venezuelans do not need it. Meanwhile, Guaido is expected to announce 2 other gathering centers in Latin America and is also considering implementing a humanitarian corridor to bring the aid into Venezuela. Christina Caicedo-Smith, VOA News, Cúcuta, Colombia.
Now, VOA Spanish service correspondent Celia Mendoza is just back from Cúcuta, Colombia, which straddles the border with Venezuela. Celia is back in New York to cover the UN Security Council efforts to end the crisis in Venezuela. She joins us live now from our United Nations studio. Celia, good to see you. Give me your firsthand impressions based on your reporting of where the situation is at the moment regarding this humanitarian crisis.
a lot of tension in the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Every day that passes, we have more people that are losing their lives because malnutrition, different issues with food shortages, as well as medicines. But it's not a real solution just yet about how that aid is going to come into Venezuela. However, the interim President Juan Guaidó, which is the leader of the assembly, said that on the 23rd of February, they will bring the help from Colombia and the other two countries. We know now Brazil and Aruba will be those other two countries into Venezuela. Now, the government of Nicolas Maduro, which is now being disputed, says that they will do everything in their power to stop any efforts to come into the country. And they had also started a campaign discrediting the aid that is coming into the country and also claiming that is different of the elements of the food will be poison or has things that are bad for people. So what we see at this moment is campaigns from both sides to try to bring people to their own side of the conversation. In the international stage, the United Nations will play a very important role. The Secretary General met with the Foreign Minister of Venezuela just yesterday here at the United Nations. We spoke to the Foreign Minister, who once again claims that they don't have a humanitarian crisis and they don't need any help. The United States are asking for election, as well as the European Union and many other countries. At least more than 47 countries have recognized him as a legitimate president of Juan Guaidó.
Well, let me follow up on that, because we had this, I think, a major rally yesterday, a big crowd in Caracas, and Guaidó's comment about on the 23rd the aid is going in. I mean, what is the evidence that that is going to be able to happen? Is that some sort of effort to force it in? What is your sense on what he was talking about there?
Every time we have asked the opposition leaders, and especially Lester Toledo, which is the person that Guaidó put in charge of the coordination of the international aid, they have been very careful of giving any details of what is the plan, how they're going to bring the food and the medicines into Venezuela. Just 3 days ago, Diosdado Cabello, which is one of the leaders of the Maduro government, came to the border in tienditas, which we have to remember is the images that were seen around the world of the containers blocking the bridge. This is a bridge that was never really used, was constructed by Colombia and Venezuela, but it was meant to have heavy traffic in terms of commerce. But that probably won't be the route that they will be using. We know that they have the National Guard there, the Venezuelan military is present, and they are very alert on the border. But we don't know if they might use Brazil or go through the ocean coming from Aruba with some of the aid, or try to use actual people to carry the food from one side to the other, which is one of the other initiatives that we saw at the International Bridge in Colombia, where volunteers, Venezuelans, asking Venezuelans to register in a page that was announced by Juan Guaidó over the weekend, where people can register to be a volunteer for the humanitarian aid. And they believe that they physically will actually try to create a human chain that will bring the food from Colombia to Venezuela. So we don't know exactly if that's what they're doing, but we know that the efforts is try to involve the people, Venezuelans, on both sides of the border, as well as to make a call to the military.
Let me just, we have a little less than a minute to go, but the military situation within the country, are they sticking with Maduro at this point? Has anyone had success in trying to put some distance between military leaders and Maduro?
So far, the military is sticking with the government of Nicolas Maduro. However, we have seen some of the members that have come out and break ranks. But what we keep seeing is a call by the international community, even the ambassador of the United States in Cucuta made that call and said, it is the time you should make the right call and join the people of Venezuela. All
right. Thank you very much, Celia, for that report. We appreciate your being down there and the information you gave us today. Thank you. So who is Juan Guaidó? Very few had actually heard of him until recently, but here's what we do know. He's 35 years old, married, an industrial engineer turned politician, a member of the centrist Social Democratic Popular Will Party. On January 5th, he was appointed head of the National Assembly, the country's main legislative body. On January 23rd, claiming the 2018 election was invalid, he declared himself interim president of Venezuela, a claim now recognized by some 50 countries, including the United States. He remains the subject of a probe by the Maduro government, which has frozen his assets and banned him from leaving the country. We'll have more on Juan Guaido later, but first, how did Venezuela, once the pride of South America, arrive at this moment in history? Some trace the start of Venezuela's collapse to March 2013, the end of socialist President Hugo Chávez's 14-year rule, following his death at the age of 58 from cancer. Chávez's vice president and hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, would narrowly win the presidency in April of 2013, beginning a 6-year term marked by frequent protests and the arrest of opposition leaders seeking to oust him. But by December 2015, with oil prices plummeting, the country's opposition party would ride a wave of popular discontent amid a rapidly deteriorating economy to win control of Venezuela's legislative body. 15 months later, in March 2017, Venezuela's Supreme Court sparks a constitutional crisis when it takes over the functions of the National Assembly. The court would later rescind that decision, but too late to end months of anti-government protests and the deaths of more than 100 people. Amid a deepening recession, Maduro's government calls for a referendum in July 2017, creating a new legislative body to rewrite the country's constitution. In February of 2018, talks between the government and the opposition collapse over the timing of the next presidential election. Opposition leaders pledged to boycott the election. But by May 2018, with the country's economy in free fall, and despite low voter turnout and allegations of vote buying, Maduro claims election victory. The opposition, along with the United States and a multilateral group of 12 Latin American governments, declare Maduro's election invalid. On January 10, 2019, ignoring the advice of neighboring countries, Maduro moves forward with his inauguration for a second 6-year term. On January 25th, just 2 weeks later, opposition leader Juan Guaido, virtually unknown outside Venezuela, declares himself the country's interim president at the largest opposition rally since 2017. He is quickly recognized by the United States and many of Venezuela's neighbors. The U.S. would later impose sanctions against Venezuela's state-owned oil company, preventing Maduro's government from collecting proceeds on its crude exports, cutting off the government's main source of revenue and putting pressure on Maduro to step aside. Still backing Maduro's government are Russia, China, and Cuba. For a look at the big picture and the geopolitical consequences of the chaos in Venezuela now, we're joined by Dr. Cynthia J. Arnson. She's director of the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, specializing in Latin American politics and international relations. She's also a member of the editorial advisory board at Foreign Affairs Latino America and Human Rights Watch Americas. Dr. Arnson, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I do want to get your take on the geopolitical stakes here. But first, assess the state of the crisis at the moment, both humanitarian and political. What stage are we in now?
Right. This is a very unstable situation. It changes by the day. As we've just heard, there are efforts to get massive amounts of humanitarian aid into the country to alleviate the tremendous crisis of hunger and lack of medicines. And this aid obviously is becoming used by the opposition to show that it's capable of delivering aid against the refusal of the Maduro government. So it's being politicized, and I think that's actually a danger.
So we have the humanitarian crisis, the political situation within the country, Maduro, his relationship with the military. Do you see any shifting signs there?
Right. There have been a handful of of military officers that have said that they are casting their lot with the opposition, with Juan Guaido. But so far, and surprisingly, there have been very few, if any, visible cracks in the armed forces. And this, of course, is the critical factor in Venezuela's future. If the armed forces remain behind Nicolás Maduro, it will be very, very difficult to see a change of government or a democratic transition of any kind.
I mean, is your sense right now that it's reached a crisis point where we could see some changes soon, or could this go on indefinitely?
I think this could drag on indefinitely. One would have thought that with the combination of the street pressures, with the defection of Chavista supporters in poor neighborhoods, with the massive international recognition that Juan Guaido has received, as well as the offers of humanitarian aid, that there would have been more people in the armed forces, particularly at the lower ranks. Also the offer of amnesty, which was very astute on the part of Guaido and his supporters, that there would have been more ferment within the military. And the fact that that has not openly cracked, it could fall like a house of cards, but so far it's very solid.
I mean, we have regional implications here. We have international implications, the role of Russia, China watching this, the U.S. How do you assess sort of the geopolitical strains of what we're seeing play out right now?
Sure. Well, I think you have to disaggregate all of those people. There are certainly a number of authoritarian governments, dictatorships that have supported Nicolás Maduro. You could add Nicaragua, Turkey into that mix. But their interests are very different. China, for example, is massively exposed in financial terms. It has lent over $60 billion to Venezuela, the bulk of it during the oil boom years, during the years of the presidency of Hugo Chavez. And since then, it has been much more reluctant to lend and has only been turning over existing loans without really extending new credit. So the Chinese, I think, ultimately want those loans to be repaid and want to see that there is a flow of oil from Venezuela to China in repayment. Russia is different. Russia sees this in geostrategic and political terms. This is an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to mess around in the so-called near abroad of the United States, what is often referred to, unfortunately, as the backyard of the United States, in the same way that Putin felt that Europe and Western powers were interfering in the crisis in Ukraine. So it's a little bit tit for tat. Russia has about $17 billion in loans, not only in oil, but also in arms. And its state-owned oil company, Rosneft, has been going around acquiring PDVSA, the state oil company's assets, at a great rate.
As we wrap up here in about a minute, what should we be looking for to see where this is headed? What developments? We look on the economic side, the political, the humanitarian, a mix of all of those.
Right. Well, it's hard to imagine that the economic situation could get much worse. I mean, this is a country with the highest level of inflation in the world. In 2018, it was estimated by the IMF to be 1,000,000%. I mean, it's hard to even wrap your mind around that, and it's increasing. So the inflation, the economic collapse is total. The oil sanctions by the United States are going to continue to bite and deprive the government of a source of foreign exchange, not its only source, but its largest source. So the economic crisis is only going to deepen. That's going to deepen the humanitarian crisis without an influx of some form of humanitarian aid. So,
and of course, the Trump administration has really made this a central part of their foreign policy right now. So the stakes for them, again, briefly, are quite high here.
Exactly. The stakes are high, and one hopes that this does not become a confrontation, say, between the United States and Russia. And you could actually see those kinds of things coming into play, for example, trying to block shipments of humanitarian aid by sea that are coming from Caribbean countries. So I think the situation is very unstable, very volatile, and extremely dangerous in many ways.
Dr. Arntzen, thanks so much for your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The U.S. has officially recognized Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido as the country's president. But incumbent President Nicolás Maduro apparently has no intention of stepping down. With tensions mounting and conditions deteriorating in Venezuela, U.S. President Donald Trump has raised the possibility of U.S. military action. Here's VOA's Brian Padden with more on that.
President Trump has said the use of U.S. military force in Venezuela is an option, but he also emphasized in his State of the Union address to Congress the need to draw down on costly military engagements around the world.
As a candidate for president, I loudly pledged a new approach. Great nations do not fight endless wars.
The U.S., most of Latin America, and Europe have recognized Juan Guaido, the head of Venezuela's National Assembly, as the country's interim president. They argue President Nicolas Maduro has no legitimacy because he rigged last year's presidential election. Maduro's socialist policies have brought the oil-rich nation to near economic ruin, with hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages, and millions fleeing the upheaval and poverty in their country. The Trump administration has increased economic pressure, freezing Venezuela's oil revenues to force Maduro out. Supporters of the military option say force may be necessary and would be welcomed by most Venezuelans to remove the Maduro government that is allegedly involved in drug trafficking and increasing political repression.
That seems to be a growing popular opinion by many Venezuelans that they view that the only way to get this criminal government out of power is by a coercive force.
Opponents point out that the economic crisis in Venezuela does not pose a security threat to the United States. A handwritten notation saying 5,000 troops to Colombia, spotted on National Security Advisor John Bolton's notepad, led to speculation that U.S. forces might be deployed to the Colombian border with Venezuela.
You could imagine a possibility that if there were a need to go into Venezuela and do humanitarian operations, or if I need to go into Venezuela and do other types of operations, such as protecting the members of the Guaido government or the National Assembly at risk.
But even a narrowly focused operation risks involving a prolonged conflict against a well-equipped Venezuela military and could bolster Maduro's support at home and in the region.
If the White House's goal is regime change in Venezuela, which appears to be the case, then they should be concerned that their actions are generating a backlash against the U.S. In Venezuela and in the region.
Canada and key Latin American allies have also cautioned against any use of force in Venezuela. Brian Padden, VOA News, Washington.
Venezuela's failing economy and rich reserves of oil have opened up the country to billions of dollars of debt. Under the leadership of the current president, Nicolas Maduro, China and Russia have floated major financial bailouts, cash, to Venezuela for the privilege of tapping into the country's abundant reserves of oil. But what does that mean for Venezuela's already crippled economy? And would the U.S. care enough about Venezuela's crisis to deploy its military? To answer some of these questions and more, we are joined now by economist Danny Bahar. He's a global economy and development fellow at the Brookings Institution here in Washington and an associate with the Harvard Center for International Development and an expert on the Venezuelan economy. Boy, there's a lot to talk about. You mentioned the Venezuelan economy, and probably starting with the question is just how bad are things there?
Yeah, Jim, well, I think it's fair to say it's probably the most distorted economy in the world. It has all kind of controls on everything you can imagine, controls on prices, controls on foreign currency. The private sector, because of these controls, have almost completely disappeared. And the country experienced during Chavez the longest and largest oil boom in its history. And all that money that was flowing in, it was used for consumption. That's why you saw a lot of the poverty rates coming down. But when the price of oil went down, suddenly the country was basically naked and unable to repay the debt back. And that is the core of the situation today. There's a huge external debt that cannot be paid. And the government went to the printing press to print money to try to cover its expenses. And that's why you have hyperinflation that is affecting the lives of everybody in the country.
So a lot of the underlying factors that get us to this political crisis are, in fact, their decision long ago to tie themselves to the oil economy and to be at the sort of mercy of the world markets that way.
Well, it's that, even though I think it's beyond that, because when the price of oil went down, you don't see any humanitarian crisis happening in any other countries. There are other countries out there that are exporting mostly oil, like Venezuela. So definitely, if the economy would have been more diversified, maybe it would have stopped it. But I think the core of this economic crisis is that it was manufactured. It was manufactured by the policies of Hugo Chavez and then Maduro, which behaved completely irresponsibly, and they did exactly the opposite of everything that an Econ 101 student will learn in its first few weeks.
I mean, part of it, we've seen the humanitarian crisis there now. We see people in the streets and shortages of food and medicine. I mean, how much longer can this go on where, there's going to be a change is going to have to come into play here?
Well, I think you're right that it's very hard to imagine a scenario in which this goes on for a longer period of time because the economic situation is getting worse and worse by the day, even though it's very bad. 9 out of 10 Venezuelans are poor. The hyperinflation causes your salary to be basically halved every 20 days. So it's very hard to imagine how this can happen stably. There's one thing that is also happening, which is the refugee crisis. And there are 3 million Venezuelans that have left, and this certainly, quote unquote, helps this cruel dictatorship to stabilize the misery, if you want to say it in some sense. So if this government stays in power, you might well see that this refugee crisis will keep increasing and increasing to numbers that could even go beyond the Syrian refugee crisis.
I mean, the Trump administration has a big stake in what's going on in Venezuela, and they've also used it to kind of go after the socialist policies that we saw beginning with Chavez and so forth. I mean, so it's also become a debate, I guess, about one's economic philosophy to governing.
Yeah, but even though I do believe that I did see those comments of President Trump in the State of the Union, and I do think that the lessons from here, some of them could be economic, but there's definitely, I mean, the big elephant here in the room is he's a cruel dictatorship that has eliminated the freedom. So it doesn't matter if it's a left-wing dictatorship or a right-wing dictatorship, they are really destroying the capacity of the Venezuelan people to live freely. So in that sense, there are a lot of economic policies that are tilt socialist. I just don't like labels, but there are a lot of these policies that have really destroyed the economy and brought us where we are now. But there's much more than that. There is no freedom of expression. Political parties have been banned. The elections are not free and fair. So there's a whole bunch of components that brought us to where we are now.
About a minute left, but do you see any way the government would relent on letting in the humanitarian goods that are so desperately needed anytime soon?
I hope they will, because as you said, they're really, really needed. I mean, there's no enough food, there's not enough medicines. People are dying from preventable diseases, like people don't have insulin to treat their diabetes, like in any other country in the world. But they are still unable to accept that there is a crisis. So they might as well keep living their lie and just avoid anything to come in and keep hurting the people.
And it's also had a huge regional impact, again, briefly, on the countries neighboring Venezuela.
Of course, and that's a lot of what you see. I've been to the border on a few occasions, and when you talk to people, you see a lot of people that are fleeing just because they didn't have food or medicines and they needed to vaccinate their kids and so on. So you do see this really impacting the lives of people there.
Economist Danny Bahar, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Please stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like our Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. You can also follow us on Twitter at Greta. As always, thanks for being plugged in.